So, folks, who didn't see this season coming for the Yankees? I did. Welcome, everybody. It's Sports Talk Live back here again. We're here to talk about the New York Yankees 2025 season, and let me just say, I'm not surprised that they couldn't get past Toronto in the ALDS. You remember at the beginning of the year, everybody was talking about that they could go back to the World Series against the Dodgers, and thank the Lord we didn't get that. Um, Even though the Dodgers are back in the World Series, I didn't want to see the rematch. But this team is exactly what I thought it would be. They are feast or famine. They rely on either hits or nothing. Um, does anybody remember in the early 2000s and late 90s those Yankee teams that were built on pitching and defense? They were not built on hitting. This is not the 50s anymore or the 1940s. You can't just get away with just having really, really, really good hitting, and the pitching is semi-decent but can bail you out. Or you can have garbage pitching, but the guys will just hit. This team literally is stuck in the old ways of before Joe Torre came here in the 1990s. So they started off decent. I think in like June, I think they had the best record. They were about 7 games up in Toronto, and then they just fell off a cliff, which is usual in the Aaron Boone era. You know, the guy's an analytical genius. Well, if he was an analytical genius, he should have seen what was happening in the summer and adjusted and made adjustments. But no, he didn't want to do that. He talked about, we'll get through it. It's not a big deal. There was one point where you fell to third place behind the Red Sox and the Blue Jays because you literally didn't want to fix the problems. They were mired in a hitting slump and you couldn't fix it. The bullpen was blowing games and you got a few reinforcements, but you didn't do much of the trade deadline. Because, folks, Aaron Boone is basically the Steinbrenner's shill. And for Brian Cashman, whatever they tell him to say is what he says. The reason they ran off Joe Girardi is very simple. Because Joe Girardi would say things that sometimes Yankees didn't like. Joe Torre would do that, but he was Joe Torre. He had, he was given a long leash there. Joe Girardi was fine at first until he started saying things and talking about how he didn't have a good team around him, that the Yankees pushed him out the door to get this guy who, if you tell him to jump, he says how high. And then, you go to the Steinbrenners, which, by the way, I don't like the owners. There's no owner in baseball that I like. They're all a bunch of greedy, rich billionaires who think that they know everything, and they don't want to pay players, even though players make too much money. All the owners, they don't care what the fans think. Do you really think the Steinbrenners care? Because if they did care, they would have gotten the reinforcements that they needed to win the American League East, but no, they had to settle for a tie. David Bednar, was he a good closer? No. I had no faith watching this guy. I'm like, this guy blows games. Remember what he was doing last year? I think he was on the Pirates. You got a guy from Pittsburgh who literally, now, Pittsburgh obviously is terrible, but the guy was blowing games out of the bullpen for them. And you think that he's going to be the long-term solution for you at the closing position? Yeah, no. That's not happening. Remember half the year when Aaron Judge wasn't hitting? What did they get him? Nothing. Because they're wasting Aaron Judge's career. He hasn't won a World Series yet. I don't know if he's going to get it. At this point, I hate to say this, but Aaron Judge, I don't want to be traded to a team that can actually win. Because the Yankees sure don't seem to want to win. Now, they beat the Red Sox in the playoffs, but honestly, watching that series, it was evident they were going to win. Because the Red Sox started off the year with, Rafael Devers, who was toxic, didn't want to play first base, didn't want to do this or that, and he was a cancer in the locker room, and the Red Sox were like 20-something and 40. Then they traded him, and the whole season flipped, and they found their way, and they made the playoffs. But nobody thought that this team was going anywhere because, once again, John Henry, who's just like the Steinbrenners, doesn't spend a dime in free agency because, I don't want to, but, I own Liverpool. And, I can make a Liverpool good, but the Red Sox, nah. Like I said, I'm not surprised that they couldn't beat Toronto. This is the team I thought that we were going to get. I remember last year in the World Series how people were bragging about how good that they were. This team is decent, but they're not anything special. Like, they're feast or famine. Why do you think that there's teams out there in the American League that can hit and can pitch? Because they actually understand how this league works. You go back and you look at the old Yankee World Series teams. What made them all special? Oh, they could hit like no one's business. But this team, they don't get it. Those days are gone. This is not the 90s anymore. It's not the 80s. Don't rely on things that worked back then to work now. I remember in the summer when they weren't hitting it, I'm like, you guys brought this on yourself because you didn't want to adjust the pitching. Now, I know people will say, well, Garrett Cole was out all year. Here's the thing, I was never really high on Garrett Cole. I didn't want him. Max Fried's a nice pitcher, but again, guys like that, yeah, they're good, but I didn't want them here. Just get a decent quality pitcher. Max Fried can't do it all himself, and Carlos Rodon, he had an up and down season, but you know, I'm going to give him a mulligan this year just because it was one season, but then the rest of the rotation, half of the time I didn't even know who the fourth or fifth guy was. Like, they were literally throwing people out there and experimenting. There was no reason to experiment halfway through the season. If you don't have a good team locked down, you don't have a team locked down. I even remember, in June when they were talking about, oh man, the Yankees are off to a great start. They're going to win the division. Yeah, no. Remember what they said about the Detroit Tigers, how the Tigers were going to win the division, and then Cleveland came out of nowhere? But let's be honest. Everybody knew the Indians were winning the World Series. We all knew they were not getting out of the wild card round because the Indians in the playoffs continue to blow games, and they just don't care about winning. And I can make another video on that if I absolutely have to because people still don't get that about them. But anyway, back to the Yankees. You know, going into next year, they're not going to do anything. They'll maybe get, one or two new guys just to try to say, hey, look at us, we did something. But you didn't do anything. If you had the best record in June and then you started going into a slump, don't you think maybe you should have changed something in the middle of June when it wasn't working instead of continuing to lose series, falling into third place, and then having to rally against Toronto? Like, why does it ever have to get to that point? I know why, but I want to see if people can tell me why that is. It's because of the sheer incompetence of Brian Cashman, who, by the way, he's been there since the 90s, but I don't think people remember that it was a guy named Gil Stein who built those 90s World Series teams. Brian Cashman just came in and just took what he had, toured it a bit, and went with it. He hasn't won anything by himself since like 2009. The way he comes off, well, we don't really need to change much. Oh, really? You don't need to change much, do you? You're totally fine with a hitting core that when they want to hit, they can hit, but when they can't do that, they can't do much of anything else. Is that really what you're happy with? Because I'm not. But, hey, this team is feast or famine. You're getting what you paid for. You're getting a pretty good to sometimes mediocre Yankees team that doesn't look like they want to be there, sometimes doesn't seem to care about winning. Where's the urgency? Where's the heart? There is none. So, yeah, that's my review of the season. Like I said, not surprised at what happened, how it turned out. They finished tied for first, lost in the tiebreaker to the Blue Jays. Of course they did, and then they got trounced by the Blue Jays in the LDS. And, by the way, Toronto and Seattle are playing in the ALCS. Would have been nice to get there, but nope. Hopefully the Blue Jays win. I don't want to see Seattle get to the World Series just because, they still haven't made it. And I want to see that continue. So it'll be probably Dodgers, Blue Jays. Yeah, that'll be fun. I'm probably not going to watch that. Well, I'll watch a little bit of it. But, yeah, Yankees deserved what they got this year. I'm not too surprised by it. We were never going to win the World Series. I said that all year. This was not a World Series team. Didn't even resemble one. And, yeah, we finished about what I thought that we would. So, that's all I got for you folks this time. Be sure to subscribe to Sports Talk Live for more great videos coming up. And I will talk to you all soon. Have a great night.